This week we are focusing in life in Yehud, the land of Judah, in the time of Macedonian domination. You remember how Alexander III of Macedon, usually known as the Great, conquered the Persian Empire. After his untimely death in Babylon in 323 BC, his surviving generals set themselves up as kings in different parts of what had previously, albeit briefly, been one united empire. Ptolemy, the son of Lagos, took Egypt, and Seleucus, previously Alexander's commander of cavalry, took Babylon, although his successors moved west and based their kingdom on the Syrian cities of Antioch and Damascus. The other generals do not directly impact our study, but both Egypt and Syria competed to control the road that followed the Mediterranean coast through what today we know as the Gaza Strip. Thus, both Egypt and Syria were interested in what happened in and around Jerusalem, usually just trying to stop the other nation taking control. The Jewish people survived these turbulent times. You knew that because we know that in the last days of the years before BC turned to AD, Herod, another king known as the Great, was king of the Jews, ruling from the city of Jerusalem. More on him later in this series. So there were Judahites living in and around Jerusalem, with other Judahites living in the more fertile region of Galilee, with Samaritans living between them to the north of Jerusalem and south of Galilee. The Macedonians struggled to see the difference between Jews and Samaritans, but the two people saw the others as being not like us. And this hostility continued into what we call New Testament times. However, in this talk, we're concentrating on life in the occupied province of Yehud. The Ptolemies of Egypt tended to rule Yehud with a light hand. So long as the Jews paid their taxes, the Ptolemies let them run their own affairs. But the Seleucids of Syria were often far more oppressive, as we shall see. As we look at Jewish life under the Macedonians, we will see two types of Judaism emerging, which continues into the New Testament, where we meet Pharisees and Sadducees. Both consider themselves to be Orthodox Jews, and the others to be somewhat less so, mistaken and confused rather than heretical. Which reminds me of disagreements within our own fellowship between liberals and conservatives, so-called, not in a political sense, but in how we interpret and apply scriptures. Graham Fisher used to comment that a liberal is someone who allows things that I would forbid, and a conservative forbids things that I would allow. He was not wrong. And so, outside observers of Jewish affairs in the period between the Testaments and beyond into New Testament times might be aware that there were some Jews that called themselves Pharisees and others that were Sadducees. Explaining what the difference was could be tricky. The movement for social and religious change at this time was Hellenism. This was the belief that the Greek way of living was superior to the culture of the people conquered by Alexander. In modern terms, we might call this cultural imperialism. So how much Hellenistic culture did the Jewish people wish to adopt? The language was forced on them. If you wanted to trade with your Greek-speaking neighbours or communicate with your Greek-speaking overlords, you could be certain that they were not going to learn Hebrew. So to communicate, you had to learn Koine Greek. Having learned Greek, many found that it was a much more user-friendly language than Hebrew or Aramaic. It was easier to write. No word processing software back then, remember. And once you could read Greek, there was a remarkable literature to enjoy, from the fables of Aesop to the war stories of Homer and Thucydides and the drama of Aeschylus and Euripides, to name just a cross-section. People liked Greek literature. However, there were some aspects of Greek culture that made all but the most ardent Hellenistic Jews uneasy. Athletic contests, for example, were always dedicated to the Olympian gods. Can a Jew offer a sacrifice to Heracles, the Greek god the Romans knew as Hercules? Those in favour would say that it was just a custom and did not mean anything, and that it would be rude not to. Those opposed would argue that this was idolatry, and thus something that no Jew could condone on any account ever. End of. There were two influential families that showed both sides of the debate over Hellenization, the Oniads and the Tobiads. Onias is an attempt to change the Hebrew Honai into Greek, Honai being a shortened form of Yohanan, which is usually anglicized as John. Sorry about this unforeseen result of using multiple languages, and I speak as Stephen, who would have been Stephanos in Greek. The Oniads, members of Honi's family and their supporters, were on the Orthodox side. Orthodox with a small o, so traditionalist followers of the Hebrew scriptures. They wanted to keep the Jews separate and apart from their Hellenistic neighbours. Perhaps this was unrealistic, but they had a clear vision of how to continue to be the chosen people in a hostile world, a worldview later taken by the Pharisees of New Testament times. On the other side were the Tobiads. They wanted to work within the Hellenistic system and were happy to take on administrative functions such as being tax gatherers under the kings of Egypt or Syria, depending on who was top dog at the time. We will start with the Oniads, who come before the Tobiads alphabetically. And our first reference is from the Apocrypha, the collection of books written in Greek during the time between the Testaments that were never included within the Hebrew canon. In the book called variously Ecclesiasticus, or The Wisdom of Jesus the son of Sirach, or just plain Sirach, we find a lengthy summary of Hebrew history. This starts in chapter 44 with the well-known phrase, "Let us now praise illustrious men, our ancestors in their successive generations. The Most High apportioned to them an abundance of glory and displayed his greatness from of old." There follows a survey of many of the highlights of Jewish history with, deep breath, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Phinehas, Joshua and Caleb, the judges, none named, Samuel, Nathan, David, Solomon, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, Elijah and Elisha, Hezekiah and Isaiah, Josiah, the last of the good kings, and then we move into the exile and return, which would have been closer to current affairs than history to Sirach when he was writing. Finally, in chapter 50, we reach the pinnacle of Hebrew history. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the high priest Simon, the son of Onias. Yes, the Simon, the son of Onias, who, and I quote, "It was the high priest Simon, son of Onias, in whose lifetime the house was repaired, and in whose days the temple was fortified. He also laid the foundations for the high double walls that enclosed the temple precincts. In his time, a water system was constructed, a pool with the vastness of the sea." And then finishing 17 verses later with, "Then Simon would come down and raise his hands over the whole assembly of the Israelites to pronounce the blessing of the Lord with his lips and to glory in his name. And once again, the people would bow down in worship to receive the blessing of the Most High. And now bless the God of all, who works great wonders everywhere on the earth, who has raised us up from birth and who deals with us according to his mercy. May he grant us joy in our hearts, and may there be peace in our days in Israel for all time to come. May his mercy toward us be confirmed, and may he deliver us in our times. What a man. These verses were taken from chapter 50 of the Wisdom of Ben Sira in the New Catholic Bible, which I accessed on the World Wide Web at BibleGateway.com. The rebuilding mentioned in the opening verses of chapter 50 can be linked to what Josephus reports happened in the time of the Seleucid king Antiochus III. More on him later. Simon, as a descendant of Zadok the priest, the one Handel set to music but sung at coronations, Simon was well respected by all pious Jews, and for once this praise seemed justified. Simon observed the law of Moses and trusted in the Lord God to guide him. On the other hand, we have the Tobiads. The children of Tobiah were a family that returned from Babylon to Judah with Zerubbabel, but who were unable to prove their ancestry and were thus barred from repossessing what they claimed as their ancestral home. There was a Tobiah who was an Ammonite who caused problems for Ezra and Nehemiah, possibly from the same family. Whether these Tobiahs were ancestors of the later intertestamental Tobiads is not certain, although it is easy to argue that because the earlier Tobiads were not allowed to reclaim their inheritance, it would explain, although not excuse, why the later Tobiads did what they did. According to Josephus, Joseph, a son of Tobiah, managed to get into the good books of Ptolemy III, also known as Euergetes I. This Ptolemy ruled Egypt from 246 to 221 BC. Ptolemy was not pleased that the Jewish high priest at the time, Onias II, had not sent the customary gift of 20 talents. Calculating the worth of precious metal in the pre-modern world is notoriously tricky, so let us just say that 20 talents of silver was a lot of dosh, and 20 talents of gold even more so. So Pharaoh wanted his precious present and sent one of his lackeys, Athenian, to warn Onias that he should pay up or pay the price. Onias, a good priest, was perhaps one of those men who aren't so heavenly minded they are no earthly use. Thus Onias was pleased when Joseph ben Tobiah offered his services as a negotiator. Joseph welcomed Athenian and entertained him right royally. When Athenian reported back to Ptolemy, he also sang the praises of his new bestie in Jerusalem, young Joseph ben Tobiah. So when Joseph travelled to Alexandria to see how things stood, Pharaoh and his wife Cleopatra were delighted to meet him. This Cleopatra, by the way, was not the Cleopatra of Roman times. Most wives and sisters of the Macedonian pharaohs were called Cleopatra. The collection of taxes across the Macedonian kingdoms was run by subcontractors. These men bid for the opportunity of collecting taxes, paid the agreed sum into the coffers of the central government, and kept any excess for themselves. When the Romans found out how it was done, they adopted the same practice, which is what we find in the Gospels when tax collectors were not at all popular with the tax-paying public. Think of little Zacchaeus in Jericho, and remember the flack Jesus got from consorting with tax collectors and other sinners. The Latin word for tax collector is publicani, and I remember as a little lad reading the King James Version of the Bible and being confused as to why Jesus got it in the neck for eating with publicans. But that was a long time ago now. Anyway, Joseph ben Tobiah borrowed enough money from his friends to win the right to collect taxes throughout Ptolemy's Asian provinces, which of course included Yehud. Ka-ching! Joseph started in the parts of Syria, currently ruled by Egypt, and with some royal troops as his enforcers went to work. Some leading citizens in Philistia refused to pay, so Joseph had 20 of the wealthiest put to death and confiscated their property. As word spread that this new tax collector took no prisoners, everyone else coughed up. Joseph was soon rolling in it. He was able to repay the money he borrowed to finance his bid and loaded Ptolemy and Cleopatra with presents, and so got the job for life and was able to pass on the position to his own son. And when Antiochus III, aka the Great, defeated Ptolemy in 200 BC and took back all the Egyptian territory in Asia, he was happy to leave tax gathering in the capable hands of the Tobiads. I'm not sure why this Antiochus merited the title of the Great. Perhaps, when compared to some of the other Antiochi, he was not too bad, but Antiochus the not too bad doesn't really work. Some royal titles are obvious. William the Conqueror, for example. Edward the Confessor was indeed a devout man, and Ethelred was unready, which does not mean that he lacked punctuality. Unready in Anglo-Saxon meant unwise or ill-advised, which he was. 100 and something years after Antiochus III the Great, we meet a successful Roman general named Gnaeus Pompeius, usually anglicised as Pompey, and not to be confused with the naval city on the south coast of England. Aged 25, he added the cognomen Magnus in imitation of Alexander, and thus became Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He was a great general, but unhappily for Pompey, there was an even greater one around at the same time, Gaius Julius Caesar. More on Pompey and Caesar and their interest in Judea and their puppet king Herod the Great later in this series. Back to Antiochus III, also known as the Great. Once again, a king from the north made war on a king from the south. The southern king is Ptolemy IV Philopator, and at first he was victorious. But Antiochus regrouped and tried again, and after a decisive victory at Panion, near the source of the river Jordan in 200 BC, he took control of all of Egypt's territory along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, which included the Jewish homeland. So far, so great. But you knew there was a but on the horizon. But elsewhere in the Mediterranean region, the winds of change were blowing. In the course of his campaign against Ptolemy IV, Antiochus III had made an agreement with Philip V of Macedon. In the event of the defeat of Ptolemy, Antiochus was to add Ptolemy's territories along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean to the Seleucid kingdom, and Philip was to take Ptolemy's allies along the coast of the Aegean Sea and add them to Macedonia. Ptolemy was to be permitted to rule Egypt, but nowhere else. What could possibly go wrong? Some years earlier, at about 215 BC, Philip of Macedon had made an alliance with Hannibal of Carthage, who was on the brink of defeating the Roman Republic. Somehow, the Romans survived Hannibal's invasion, even with the war elephants he'd managed to get across the Alps. By 202 BC, Rome was on the attack, and the Second Punic War ended with Hannibal being decisively defeated at the Battle of Zama in North Africa by the Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio, who was henceforth allowed to add Africanus to his name. And now it gets confusing. Sorry. If some of the people and places I'm about to throw at you are unfamiliar, just go with the flow. This is background to the Bible, not foreground. No one will be spiritually lost if your understanding of ancient history is less than perfect. If ever you do need to know any of this, look it up. Full disclosure, I am following F.F. Bruce's Israel and the Nations with fact-checking mainly from the Oxford Dictionary of the Classical World. So now you know. With the defeat of Ptolemy Philopator by Antiochus the Great, the Egyptian-controlled cities along the coast of Asia Minor fell to Philip V of Macedon. Some of the city-states wanted their independence and asked for Roman support. Rome sent General Gaius Flaminius to intervene, and he duly proclaimed the independence of all Greek city-states in Asia Minor in 198 BC, and backed this up by defeating Philip at Kynoskephalae in Thessaly in 197 BC. Philip withdrew to Macedon. Rome withdrew for the time being, but some states on the mainland of Greece wanted to make sure Rome never returned. They called upon Antiochus to liberate the newly liberated states from Roman protection. In 192 BC, Antiochus and his army arrived in Greece, occupied the island of Euboea, close to Athens, and part of Thessaly, close to Macedon. Rome was not impressed and sent back the legions, where they soon defeated Antiochus at the historic site of Thermopylae. Rome continued the war across the Aegean Sea into Asia Minor. In 190 BC, Antiochus's fleet was destroyed in a naval engagement in the Aegean. Having won control of the sea, Rome could send an army east into Asia Minor, led by the brother of the general who defeated Hannibal, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, later named Asiaticus. Antiochus was defeated at Magnesia in 190 BC and accepted the Roman peace terms, although demands would be more accurate than terms. Antiochus had little room to maneuver. These terms were confirmed by the Peace of Apamea in 188 BC, with Antiochus withdrawing beyond the Taurus Mountains at the eastern end of the Anatolian Peninsula, surrendering his remaining elephants and warships, an unlikely combination, and I don't suppose the elephants ever travelled by boat. Antiochus also had to agree to stop recruiting soldiers from Greece and to pay an indemnity of 15,000 talents to be paid over the next 12 years. In total, that's about 90,000 drachmae, which is a serious amount of dosh in any currency, and Antiochus struggled to pay. He'd lost the wealthiest parts of his empire, and now was being pressed by rebels to the north and east who refused to pay any more tax. Antiochus was desperate and started to loot temples to get whatever he could. It was during one of these raids in 187 BC that he was killed by angry locals. Even the great have to die, and Antiochus did. Meanwhile, back in Yehud, Joseph the Tobiad had transferred the right to collect taxes to his sons, but it was still the same business doing the same thing. Joseph had been canny enough to agree a 22-year contract with Antiochus, and as he'd been bringing in the tribute, there was no reason for the Seleucids to break it. Joseph's son, Hyrcanus, another name that reoccurs on a regular basis throughout the time between the Testaments, Hyrcanus, son of Joseph, transferred his allegiance to the royal family in Alexandria. Thus we see a family divided, with brothers and cousins serving different masters. More than likely, this was happening across Jewish society, but as no one recorded their stories, we do not know about them. So the Tobiads had taken the decision to work with or for the Macedonians, first with Egypt, then with Syria, and eventually with different members of the same family serving different masters. So that was the Tobiad family, an example of Jews who sat lightly on the law of Moses and put their trust in their own ability to make money, which is by no means something exclusive to Jews. But there were others who tried to keep Torah, and if it meant that certain careers were closed to them, then so be it. The Oneids were an example of those who sought to serve the law. Some were blessed with the material rewards that came the way of all priests, and especially so for the high priestly family. In the Gospels, we meet a high priestly family who'd done well for themselves materialistically. The house of Hanan, house here in the sense of a dynastic family. Hanan's priestly descendants included both Annas, or Anunas, as Josephus spells it, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas. More about them some other time. But the families of Hanan and Tobiah were not typical. Most Jews, whether living in Judah, Galilee, or further afield in the diaspora, did what they could to keep faith with the Lord through keeping his commandments, paid their taxes when they had to, and generally tried to keep out of trouble and leave children and grandchildren to keep their name alive. There was still little understanding of any reward in a life to come. Most Jews believed that if they kept God's law, then he would reward them in the here and now. This view was soon to be put to the test in the horrors that befell the Jewish people in the days of the next Antiochus. Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, in full, Theos Epiphanes, God manifest. We meet him next week, so watch out. But in brief, Antiochus Epiphanes unleashed a wave of persecution on the faithful Jews. Jews were martyred for their faith, and with this calamity came the realization that there must be more to life than this. So the Holy Spirit put the hope of heaven in their hearts. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so come back next time. While there were some, even in Jerusalem, that bought into the way of life enjoyed by the Greek settlers in Judah, there were others who knew that this was not God's way. The Seleucid rulers of Judah did much more than the Ptolemies in trying to encourage Hellenization. There were some Jews that enjoyed the theatre and gymnasium and other social activities. Very few would buy into the worship of Greek gods in their temples, but more were happy to go along with some of the paganistic aspects of Greek life, such as the sacrifice to the gods, so-called, before a horse race or a dramatic performance. But there were some who realized that this was the foot in the door for Hellenism. If we smile politely while an animal is sacrificed before the play starts at the theatre, will that eventually lead to a full acceptance of all aspects of Greek culture, including their religion? Some were not willing to take that risk and tried to live separately from the Hellenistic world around them. These were called the Hasidim or Hasideans, the pious, or if you prefer, the saints. We will meet these people as we look at the revolt of the Maccabees later on, and we will see their spiritual descendants in the Pharisees of New Testament times. I seem to be dropping too many hints about what's going to happen in the coming weeks of this series, so I will stop and instead look back. I hope we can all see that God was in control throughout this period. The heirs of Alexander the Great have done what God wanted them to do in bringing the Persian Empire to its close. We can see the next great power about to come on the scene, Rome. Again, they have a role to play in God's great plan. Could the gospel message have spread so wide, so quickly under the Macedonian kingdoms? I think not. But the Greek language was a great help for gospel preachers who could be confident that wherever they went around the Mediterranean Sea and beyond, they would find people who spoke Greek. Even though we are still 200 years before the birth of the Christ, we can see the beginnings of the world in which he was to enter. A world where the chosen people still had a homeland and a temple, and where the chosen people could and did live and prosper far away from Jerusalem, keeping their faith through public assemblies in synagogues, where they could read from and study the scriptures in a Greek translation prepared in Ptolemy's great library in Alexandria. So while the times they were a changing, God kept faith with his people and kept his plan of salvation moving forward until the time was right. And speaking of time, I've taken enough of yours this evening, so let's close with a prayer.